Close your eyes and imagine standing at the edge of the ancient city of Chang'an, in what is now modern-day Xi'an, China. The year is 130 BCE, and before you stretches a network of routes that will become known as the Silk Road, though this name won't be given to it for another 2,000 years. The term Silk Road was actually coined by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, long after the routes had faded from their glory. But in those early days, when the Han Dynasty ruled China, no one could have imagined that these pathways would connect civilizations across an entire continent. The Silk Road wasn't a single road at all, but rather a vast web of interconnected routes spanning over 4,000 miles from East Asia to the Mediterranean Sea. Caravans would travel these paths for months, sometimes years, crossing some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, from the scorching Taklamakan Desert to the frigid passes of the Pamir Mountains. It all began with silk, that lustrous fabric that the Chinese had been producing since at least 3000 BCE. The secret of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms and the production of silk, was so jealously guarded that revealing it to foreigners was punishable by death in ancient China. For centuries, silk remained an almost mythical material in the West, worth its weight in gold. The Chinese princess who allegedly smuggled silkworm eggs out of China did so by hiding them in her elaborate headdress, though this may be legend rather than fact. What we do know is that silk became the most desired luxury item in the ancient world, drawing merchants and adventurers eastward like a compass needle seeking north. But the story truly begins with a man named Zhang Qian, a diplomat of the Han Dynasty. In 138 BCE, Emperor Wu sent Zhang Qian on a mission westward to form alliances against the nomadic Xiongnu tribes who threatened China's borders. Zhang Qian was captured and held prisoner for 10 years, but when he finally escaped and returned to China in 125 BCE, he brought back detailed accounts of the western regions, lands the Chinese had only heard whispers of before. Zhang Qian described magnificent horses in Fergana, a region in modern-day Uzbekistan, horses that sweated blood and were far superior to Chinese breeds. These descriptions captivated Emperor Wu, who saw these horses as crucial for his cavalry. This desire for Central Asian horses became one of the driving forces behind China's expansion westward, opening the routes that would become the Silk Road. The horses Zhang Qian described were likely suffering from a parasitic infection that made them appear to sweat blood, but to the Chinese, they seemed almost supernatural. The Han Dynasty launched military campaigns to acquire these prized animals, establishing a presence in Central Asia that would facilitate trade for centuries to come. As caravans began to move regularly between East and West, they carried far more than silk. Spices, precious stones, glassware, metals, and ideas flowed in both directions. The Silk Road became a conduit not just for goods, but for the exchange of knowledge, religion, art, and culture that would shape the ancient world in ways its travelers could never have imagined. And so the greatest trade route in human history was born, not from a single decision or a grand plan, but from curiosity, ambition, and the eternal human desire to discover what lies beyond the horizon. As the first century of the Common Era dawned, the Silk Road had begun to pulse with life like a great artery connecting the distant corners of the known world. Picture a caravan setting out from Chang'an in the cool hours before sunrise. Perhaps 30 camels laden with bolts of silk, their bells chiming softly in rhythm with their steady footsteps. The Bactrian camel, with its 2 distinctive humps, was the true hero of the Silk Road. These remarkable creatures could carry loads of up to 500 pounds and travel for days without water, their bodies perfectly adapted to the extreme conditions they would face. Their thick fur protected them from both the freezing mountain passes and the burning desert sands. Without these resilient animals, the Silk Road as we know it could never have existed. The journey from one end of the Silk Road to the other could take anywhere from 2 to 3 years to complete. But here's something that might surprise you. Individual merchants rarely traveled the entire length. Instead, goods passed through many hands, moving from merchant to merchant, town to town, like a relay race spanning continents. A bolt of silk that began in Chang'an might pass through 20 different traders before finally reaching a Roman senator's villa thousands of miles away. Along these routes, approximately every 20 to 30 miles, caravanserais appeared like oases of civilization. These fortified inns provided shelter, food, and water for both travelers and their animals. The word caravanserai comes from Persian, meaning caravan palace, and they truly were palaces of rest in otherwise inhospitable terrain. Within their thick walls, merchants from different lands would meet, share stories, exchange information about road conditions, and conduct business, creating vibrant temporary communities in the middle of nowhere. One of the first major stops heading west from Chang'an was the city of Dunhuang, perched at the edge of the formidable Taklamakan Desert. Dunhuang served as the last major outpost of Chinese civilization before the desert crossing. Here, merchants would rest, resupply, and make offerings at Buddhist temples, praying for safe passage through what lay ahead. The Taklamakan's name is said to mean, "Go in and you won't come out," in the local Uyghur language, a sobering reminder of the dangers that awaited. The desert crossing could be attempted via two main routes. The northern route, which skirted along the base of the Tian Shan Mountains, or the southern route, which followed the edge of the Kunlun mountain range. Both paths had their perils. Travelers faced scorching heat during the day and bitter cold at night, fierce sandstorms that could bury entire caravans, and the constant threat of running out of water. Ancient Chinese records describe hearing phantom voices in the desert, likely the wind whistling through rock formations, that would lure travelers away from their caravans to die alone in the sands. But the challenges bred innovation and cooperation. Merchants traveling the Silk Road developed sophisticated systems of credit that allowed them to conduct business without carrying large amounts of coins or precious metals, which would have made them targets for bandits. They created something called a flying money system, where a merchant could deposit funds in one city and receive a paper certificate that could be redeemed in another city hundreds of miles away. This was an early precursor to modern banking, born from necessity on these ancient trade routes. Buddhism spread along the Silk Road during this period, traveling from its birthplace in India eastward into Central Asia and eventually into China. Monks accompanied the merchant caravans, establishing monasteries and translating sacred texts. One of the most famous was the Buddhist monk Xuanzang, who in 629 CE embarked on a 17-year journey from China to India and back, traveling through the Silk Road territories. His detailed accounts of his travels provided invaluable information about the regions he visited and helped spread Buddhist teachings throughout East Asia. Night falls on the caravan. The camels are settled, their day's work done. The merchants gather around small fires, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. They speak different languages, worship different gods, but here, under the vast canopy of stars, they are united by the road, this ribbon of earth and sand and stone that has woven their fates together. As dawn breaks over the desert, our caravan presses onward, and ahead in the distance, the spires and domes of Samarkand begin to shimmer into view. This city, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, has stood for over 2,500 years as a jewel of Central Asia, a crossroads where cultures collided and merged in spectacular fashion. Samarkand, located in modern-day Uzbekistan, earned its reputation as one of the greatest centers of commerce and learning along the entire Silk Road. By the time our travelers would have arrived there, sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, the city was already ancient. Its markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world: Chinese silk beside Persian carpets, Indian spices next to Roman glassware. The air would have been thick with a dozen different languages, the scent of exotic foods, and the constant hum of negotiation and trade. But Samarkand was more than just a marketplace. The city became a remarkable center for astronomical research and mathematics. Scholars from across Asia gathered here to share knowledge, and in later centuries, Observatories built in Samarkand would make calculations of the length of the year that were accurate to within 1 minute, an extraordinary achievement for the pre-modern world. The Silk Road didn't just carry material goods. It carried ideas, scientific knowledge, and philosophical insights that enriched every civilization it touched. The wealth that flowed through these Silk Road cities was staggering. Historical records indicate that a single bolt of high-quality Chinese silk could sell for the equivalent of a Roman soldier's annual salary by the time it reached the Mediterranean. This extraordinary markup wasn't simply greed. It reflected the genuine costs and risks of transportation across thousands of miles of dangerous territory, as well as the many middlemen who each took their share along the way. Among the most valuable commodities traveling west from China were not just silk, but also porcelain and paper. The Chinese had developed porcelain, that translucent, delicate ceramic, during the Tang dynasty, around 600 CE. Europeans wouldn't master this technique for another 1,000 years, and Chinese porcelain became so prized in the West that China became the English word for fine dinnerware. Paper, invented in China during the Han dynasty around 100 CE, gradually made its way westward along the Silk Road, revolutionizing record-keeping and communication in every society it reached. From the West came equally precious goods. Roman glassware, renowned for its clarity and craftsmanship, fascinated Chinese buyers who had never seen such transparent vessels. Gold and silver coins from various empires, precious stones from mines in what is now Afghanistan and Iran, and textiles like wool from the Mediterranean, all these flowed eastward. But perhaps most significantly, from the Arabian Peninsula came frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins used in religious ceremonies and medicine, so valuable that they feature prominently in biblical accounts. The city of Kashgar, sitting at the western edge of the Taklamakan Desert, served as another crucial junction where the northern and southern routes around the desert converged. Here, merchants would rest for weeks or even months, waiting for the right season to attempt the next leg of their journey. Kashgar's Sunday market became legendary, a vast bazaar where deals worth kingdoms were struck with nothing more than a handshake and a shared cup of tea. This tradition of honor-based commerce created bonds of trust that transcended cultural and linguistic barriers, a necessity when contracts couldn't be enforced across such vast distances. The Sogdians, an Iranian people from Central Asia, emerged as the master merchants of the Silk Road. They established trading colonies in cities across the route and became known as the Phoenicians of the Silk Road for their commercial acumen. The Sogdians were polyglots, speaking multiple languages, and they developed their own script and culture that absorbed influences from everywhere they traded. They served as translators, guides, and middlemen, their networks of family connections spanning from China to the Mediterranean. Without the Sogdians, the Silk Road might have remained fragmented routes rather than becoming a truly integrated system of trade. As evening settles over Samarkand, the great market begins to quiet. Merchants retire to caravanserais, their day's trading done, their purses heavier or lighter depending on fortune and skill. Tomorrow they will rise and continue their journeys, some heading east toward the rising sun, others west toward lands they've only heard described in stories. But tonight, they rest in this city that belongs to everyone and no one, this place built by commerce and enriched by every traveler who has passed through its gates. The caravan departs Samarkand as the first light touches the snow-capped peaks in the distance. Ahead lies one of the most formidable challenges of the entire Silk Road journey, the crossing of the Pamir Mountains, a place so high and remote that medieval travelers called it the roof of the world. The Pamir mountain range, where the borders of modern-day Tajikistan, Afghanistan, China, and Kyrgyzstan meet, presented travelers with passes that reached heights of over 15,000 feet above sea level. At these altitudes, the air becomes thin and precious, each breath a labor. The famous Venetian merchant Marco Polo, who traveled the Silk Road in the 13th century, wrote that fires burned with less heat in the Pamirs and that food took much longer to cook, one of the earliest recorded observations of how altitude affects atmospheric pressure and temperature. He noted that travelers would need to rest for days to acclimatize before attempting the highest passes. The journey through these mountains could only be attempted during certain months of the year. Winter snows made the passes completely impassable, while spring avalanches posed deadly threats. Summer and early autumn provided narrow windows of opportunity, but even then, sudden storms could trap caravans for weeks. Travelers would mark their route with cairns, carefully stacked stones that served as guideposts in areas where a wrong turn could mean wandering into oblivion. Some of these ancient cairns still stand today, silent witnesses to countless journeys across the centuries. Once through the Pamirs, caravans descended into the rich lands of Persia, where the Silk Road connected with one of humanity's other great ancient highways, the Royal Road of the Persian Empire. The Persians had been masters of long-distance communication and trade long before the Silk Road flourished. Their Royal Road, built around 500 BCE, stretched from Sardis in modern-day Turkey to Susa in modern-day Iran, covering over 1,500 miles. When these networks merged, they created an unprecedented system of connectivity spanning from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Persian cities like Merv, Nishapur, and Ray became thriving cosmopolitan centers where East truly met West. Merv, located in what is now Turkmenistan, was once described by medieval geographers as the mother of the world. At its height during the 12th century, Merv may have been the largest city in the world, with a population exceeding 500,000 people. Its libraries rivaled those of Baghdad, its gardens were celebrated in poetry, and its markets displayed goods from 3 continents. The city's complex irrigation systems, fed by the Murghab River, transformed an arid landscape into a verdant paradise. In these Persian territories, travelers encountered Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions. Zoroastrian fire temples dotted the landscape, their sacred flames kept burning continuously, some for centuries. The Zoroastrian emphasis on truth-telling and honest dealing influenced the commercial culture of the Silk Road. Many merchants adopted Zoroastrian practices, finding that the religion's ethical framework aligned well with the trust-based commerce necessary for long-distance trade. The prophet Zoroaster's teachings about the cosmic struggle between good and evil would later influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Sasanian Empire, which ruled Persia from 224 to 651 CE, actively promoted and protected Silk Road trade. Sasanian silver coins became a standard currency across much of the route, trusted for their consistent weight and purity. These coins have been found in archaeological sites from England to Korea, testament to how far Persian influence extended. The Sasanians also maintained a system of mounted couriers who could carry messages across their empire with remarkable speed. A message could travel from one end of the empire to the other in just 9 days, an astonishing achievement for the pre-modern world. The Persian language itself became a lingua franca of sorts along much of the Silk Road, especially in its Central Asian sections. Merchants who might not share a native tongue could often communicate in Persian, which absorbed vocabulary from the many cultures that used it. Even today, Persian words can be found in languages from Turkish to Chinese, linguistic fossils of the Silk Road's reach. Words for luxury goods, trading terms, and units of measurement traveled along the route just as surely as the physical commodities themselves. As the sun sets over the Persian plateau, painting the ancient mud brick buildings in shades of amber and gold, our travelers find shelter in yet another caravanserai. The evening air carries the scent of saffron and rosewater from nearby kitchens. Somewhere, a musician plays a tar, its melancholic notes drifting across the courtyard. Tomorrow, the journey continues westward, drawing ever closer to the great cities of the Mediterranean. But tonight, in this moment, the Silk Road feels less like a physical place and more like a state of being. A perpetual journey between yesterday and tomorrow, between here and there, between the familiar and the unknown. The caravan presses westward, and now the landscape begins to change once more. The arid plains of Persia gradually give way to more fertile lands as our travelers approach the great cities of the Levant, those ancient crossroads where the Silk Road would finally meet the Mediterranean Sea and the vast trading networks of the Roman world. Baghdad, founded in 762 CE as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, became perhaps the greatest nexus of knowledge and commerce the medieval world had ever seen. At its peak in the 9th and 10th centuries, Baghdad was home to over 1 million people, making it the largest city in the world at that time. Its famous House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, gathered scholars from across the known world to translate and preserve texts from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Chinese sources. Mathematical concepts from India, including the revolutionary idea of zero, combined with Greek geometry and Chinese astronomical observations to create new branches of knowledge. The very word algorithm comes from the name of the Persian mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, who worked in Baghdad's House of Wisdom. The goods that reached Baghdad's markets represented the culmination of the Silk Road's east-to-west journey. But here they mixed with treasures from another great trade network, the maritime spice routes that brought cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, and pepper from India's Malabar coast. A merchant standing in Baghdad's souks could purchase goods that had traveled by sea from Southeast Asia and goods that had crossed overland from China, sometimes finding that items from neighboring regions had taken vastly different routes to arrive at the same destination. As caravans continued west toward the Mediterranean, they passed through the ancient city of Palmyra, located in modern-day Syria. Palmyra's ruins still stand today as testament to its former glory. This desert city thrived for centuries as a vital link in the Silk Road, controlling the desert routes between the Roman Empire and Mesopotamia. Queen Zenobia, who ruled Palmyra in the 3rd century CE, briefly challenged Rome itself, conquering Egypt and much of Asia Minor before Emperor Aurelian defeated her forces. Palmyra's wealth came directly from its position on the trade routes. Merchants paid taxes to pass through, and Palmyran traders grew rich facilitating exchanges between East and West. The Nabateans, an Arab people who controlled the incense routes through the Arabian Peninsula, created another crucial link in the network. Their capital city of Petra, carved into rose-red cliffs in what is now Jordan, served as a major trading hub where spices and incense from the south met silk and goods from the east. The Nabateans were master hydraulic engineers, creating sophisticated systems to capture and store water in their desert environment. Their rock-cut architecture wasn't just beautiful, it was functional, providing cool storage for perishable goods in the desert heat. The Romans had an insatiable appetite for Eastern luxuries, particularly silk. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder complained in the 1st century CE that Rome was spending approximately 100 million sesterces annually on imports from the East, an enormous sum that represented a significant drain on Roman gold reserves. He disapproved of silk particularly, calling it immoral because its translucent quality was considered too revealing. Despite such complaints, demand only increased. Roman senators and wealthy citizens competed to display their status through Eastern luxuries, and silk became so associated with wealth and power that eventually, only the emperor was permitted to wear certain types of all-silk garments. The Mediterranean port cities of Antioch and Tyre became the final destinations for many Silk Road goods entering the Roman world. Antioch, located in modern-day Turkey near the Syrian border, was the Roman Empire's 3rd largest city and a major commercial center. Here, goods would be redistributed throughout the Mediterranean by ship, reaching as far as Britain and North Africa. The city's markets were legendary. The geographer Strabo wrote that one could find anything in the world for sale in Antioch's bazaars, a claim that wasn't far from the truth. The exchange wasn't entirely one-sided. While silk and spices flowed west, Roman glassware, metalwork, and wine traveled east. Roman glass techniques were particularly admired. The Romans had perfected glassblowing around the 1st century BCE, creating vessels of unprecedented clarity and delicacy. When Roman glass reached China, it was considered as precious as jade. Archaeological excavations in Chinese tombs have uncovered Roman glass vessels, carefully preserved as treasured possessions. Similarly, wine from the Mediterranean regions became fashionable among Persian and Central Asian elites, who acquired a taste for these foreign beverages. Perhaps most remarkably, the Silk Road facilitated a limited but real direct contact between the Roman and Chinese empires, despite the thousands of miles separating them. Chinese records mention an embassy arriving from Qin, the Chinese name for Rome, in 166 CE, claiming to represent the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. While historians debate whether this was an official Roman embassy or simply enterprising merchants claiming imperial authority, the very fact that such contact occurred demonstrates the Silk Road's achievement in connecting the world's two greatest powers of the ancient world. The Mediterranean stretches before us now, its waters glinting in the afternoon sun. A bolt of silk that began its journey in Chang'an 2 years ago is finally unloaded from a camel's back and placed aboard a Roman merchant ship. It has passed through dozens of hands, traveled thousands of miles, crossed deserts and mountains, survived sandstorms and snowstorms. Soon it will drape the shoulders of a Roman matron who will never know the names of the artisans who wove it, the camels that carried it, or the merchants who traded it. But in its threads are woven the connections between distant peoples, the fruit of countless journeys, and the dream of a world where barriers of distance and difference can be overcome. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the Silk Road entered what many historians consider its golden age, the period from roughly the 7th to the 10th century CE, when the Tang dynasty in China and the Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world created the stability and prosperity necessary for trade to flourish as never before. The Tang dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 CE, actively embraced foreign cultures and trade in a way few Chinese dynasties had before or would after. The Tang capital of Chang'an became the most cosmopolitan city in the world, home to over 1 million people at its height. Walking through its streets, one would encounter merchants from Persia, monks from India, traders from Arabia, and envoys from as far away as Byzantium. The city had designated neighborhoods for foreign residents, and Tang emperors welcomed foreign religions. Buddhist temples stood alongside Zoroastrian fire temples, Christian churches, and Islamic mosques. This remarkable religious tolerance created an environment where ideas could flourish alongside commerce. Tang dynasty records describe a vibrant international community in Chang'an that included Central Asian musicians, Persian acrobats, and Indian mathematicians. Foreign fashions became trendy among Tang aristocrats. Women wore clothing inspired by Central Asian styles, played polo, a game imported from Persia, and developed a taste for exotic foods and wines. Archaeological excavations of Tang tombs have revealed ceramic figurines of foreign merchants and travelers, their features carefully rendered to show their diverse origins, testament to how familiar foreign faces had become in Tang China. During this golden age, papermaking technology, one of China's most transformative inventions, finally reached the Islamic world through a remarkable turn of events. In 751 CE, Tang and Arab forces clashed at the Battle of Talas in Central Asia. The Arabs emerged victorious, and among their prisoners were Chinese artisans who knew the secrets of paper production. These craftsmen were brought to Samarkand, where they established the first paper mill outside of China. From there, papermaking spread throughout the Islamic world and eventually to Europe, revolutionizing literacy and learning across civilizations. Sometimes the greatest exchanges happen not through peaceful trade, but through the unpredictable accidents of history. The Abbasid Caliphate, which governed much of the Islamic world from 750 to 1258 CE, invested heavily in infrastructure that supported Silk Road commerce. They maintained an extensive network of roads, built caravanserais at regular intervals, and established postal systems that doubled as intelligence networks. The Abbasids minted gold dinars that became trusted currency across vast regions, from North Africa to Central Asia. Their coins have been found in Viking hordes in Scandinavia, carried there through a northern branch of the Silk Road that ran through the steppes of Russia, evidence of how interconnected the medieval world had become. Medicine and medical knowledge flowed along the Silk Road with remarkable consequences. Chinese medical texts describing acupuncture and herbal remedies traveled westward, while Islamic and Greek medical knowledge, particularly the works of physicians like Galen, moved eastward. Persian physicians synthesized Greek, Indian, and Chinese medical traditions, creating comprehensive medical encyclopedias. The Persian polymath Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine in the early 11th century, a text that drew on sources from 3 continents and would remain a standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Europe for over 600 years. Musical instruments traveled the Silk Road as readily as silks and spices, and with them came new forms of artistic expression. The pipa, a 4-stringed lute that became central to Chinese classical music, originated in Persia and Central Asia before being adopted and transformed by Chinese musicians during the Tang dynasty. Similarly, the oud from the Middle East would eventually influence the development of the European lute. These instruments carried not just new sounds, but entire musical systems, scales, and rhythms that enriched the musical traditions of every culture they touched. The technique of making ceramics with cobalt blue decorations, a style that would become iconic in Chinese porcelain, actually originated in Persia. Persian potters had been using cobalt blue glazes for centuries, and during the Tang dynasty, this technique traveled eastward along the Silk Road. Chinese artisans adopted and refined it, eventually creating the blue and white porcelain that would become one of China's most famous exports. Centuries later, this same porcelain would travel back west along the Silk Road, inspiring Persian and Islamic potters to create their own variations, completing a full circle of artistic exchange. The cultivation and spread of crops along the Silk Road had profound effects on cuisines across Eurasia. Cotton, originally domesticated in the Indus Valley, spread both east to China and west to the Mediterranean. Peaches and apricots traveled from China to Persia and beyond. The very word apricot comes from the Latin praecoquum, but was influenced by the Arabic al-barkak, reflecting the fruit's journey. Meanwhile, crops like watermelons, almonds, and pistachios moved from Central Asia and Persia into China. These agricultural exchanges fundamentally altered diets and farming practices across continents, changes so complete that we often forget these foods were once exotic imports. Night falls over the Silk Road in its golden age, and tonight there is a special luminosity to the darkness. In Chang'an, oil lamps burn late in foreign quarters as merchants calculate profits in multiple currencies. In Baghdad, scholars debate philosophy, their discussions enriched by texts from Greece, India, and China. In Samarkand, a Persian musician teaches a Chinese student a new melody, while nearby, a Sogdian trader samples tea for the first time, a beverage that will eventually captivate the world. The Silk Road has become more than a trade route. It has become a living bridge between cultures, a space where humanity discovers that despite all our differences, we share common dreams, common needs, and a common curiosity about the world beyond our horizons. Among the countless travelers who journeyed along the Silk Road throughout its long history, certain names have echoed through the centuries, their stories becoming inseparable from the legend of the route itself. These were not just merchants seeking profit, but explorers, pilgrims, and adventurers driven by curiosity, faith, and the irresistible pull of the unknown. Marco Polo remains perhaps the most famous Silk Road traveler, though his journey came relatively late in the route's history. In 1271, at just 17 years old, Marco departed Venice with his father and uncle, beginning a 24-year odyssey that would take him across the entire length of the Silk Road to the court of Kublai Khan in China. His subsequent account, The Travels of Marco Polo, introduced medieval Europeans to the wonders of the East in unprecedented detail, describing paper money, coal for heating, asbestos cloth, and the Grand Canal of China. While some historians have questioned whether Marco Polo actually completed all the journeys he claimed, His book inspired generations of explorers and merchants, and is said to have been among the possessions Christopher Columbus carried on his voyage to the Americas. But Marco Polo was far from the first or most significant traveler to document the Silk Road. More than 6 centuries earlier, the Chinese Buddhist monk Xuanzang had undertaken an epic 17-year journey to India and back, departing in 629 CE against the explicit orders of the Tang Emperor. Xuanzang's mission was religious, to obtain authentic Buddhist scriptures from their source, but his detailed records of the kingdoms, peoples, and cities he encountered became invaluable historical documents. He traveled through the Taklamakan Desert, crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains, studied at the great monastery of Nalanda in India, and returned to China with over 600 Buddhist texts loaded onto 22 horses. His journey later inspired the classic Chinese novel Journey to the West, which transformed his historical pilgrimage into a fantastical adventure. The Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta undertook what may be the most extensive travels of any medieval person, covering approximately 75,000 miles over 29 years in the 14th century. Though his journeys extended far beyond the Silk Road, reaching as far as West Africa and Southeast Asia, significant portions of his travels followed the ancient routes through Central Asia, Persia, and India. Ibn Battuta's account provides a fascinating glimpse of the Silk Road in its later period, when Mongol rule had created what historians call the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability that made long-distance travel safer than it had been in centuries. His descriptions of the sophisticated postal relay systems maintained by the Mongols reveal how travelers could cover vast distances with remarkable speed when properly equipped with imperial credentials. The Mongol Empire, established by Genghis Khan in the early 13th century, had a paradoxical effect on the Silk Road. The Mongol conquests were devastating. Cities like Samarkand, Bokhara, and Baghdad suffered terrible destruction. Yet once the Mongols established their empire, which at its height stretched from Korea to Hungary, they created the largest contiguous land empire in history and guaranteed security along the Silk Road routes. The Mongols established a sophisticated relay system called the Yam, with stations every 25 to 30 miles where riders could obtain fresh horses. With proper authorization, a messenger could travel up to 200 miles in a single day, a speed that wouldn't be surpassed until the invention of the railroad. Under Mongol rule, European merchants reached China in unprecedented numbers. The Venetians and Genoese established trading posts in Mongol territories, and for a brief period in the 13th and 14th centuries, travel between Europe and East Asia became almost routine. The Franciscan monk John of Plano Carpini reached the Mongol capital of Karakorum in 1246, becoming one of the first Europeans to visit Mongolia. William of Rubruck followed in 1253, providing detailed ethnographic observations of Mongol life. These accounts revealed to Europeans that the Mongols, whom they had feared as barbarian invaders, presided over sophisticated courts where multiple religions were tolerated and intellectual discourse flourished. The Silk Road also carried with it darker exchanges. Diseases traveled along the trade routes just as readily as goods and ideas. The bubonic plague, known in Europe as the Black Death, likely spread westward along Silk Road routes in the 14th century. The disease, carried by fleas on rats that infested grain shipments and trading vessels, devastated populations from China to Europe. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. This catastrophic pandemic demonstrated the double-edged nature of global connectivity. The same routes that brought prosperity and cultural exchange could also carry unprecedented catastrophe. The plague's impact was so severe that it disrupted trade patterns for decades and contributed to the gradual decline of some Silk Road cities. Despite such calamities, remarkable stories of individual resilience and adventure continued to emerge from the Silk Road. Rabban Bar Salma, an Nestorian Christian monk born in Beijing around 1220, traveled westward in the 1270s and 1280s, eventually reaching as far as Bordeaux, Paris, and Rome, a reverse journey that mirrored Marco Polo's eastward trek. Bar Salma's mission was diplomatic and religious, representing the Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia and seeking alliances with European powers. His journey illustrates how the Silk Road facilitated not just trade but also complex diplomatic negotiations between distant powers, with individuals serving as human bridges between civilizations that had previously known each other only through rumor and legend. The caravanserais that dotted the Silk Road became repositories of stories and legends themselves. Travelers would scratch their names, prayers, and messages into the walls, ancient graffiti that has survived in some locations to this day. In certain caravanserais, one can still see inscriptions in multiple languages and scripts: Chinese, Arabic, Persian, Sogdian, and others, layered over centuries. These markings serve as a physical record of the route's diversity, a testament to the countless individuals who passed through, each carrying their own hopes, fears, and dreams across the distances. Imagine sitting in one of these caravanserais as evening falls, listening to the stories being exchanged around the fire. A Persian merchant speaks of the great Khan's court, where summer palaces gleam with gold. A Buddhist monk describes mountains so high that snow never melts from their peaks. A Venetian trader tells of cities in the east where the streets are paved with stone and night markets blaze with 1,000 lanterns. Some stories are true, some are exaggerated, and some are pure fantasy, but all of them speak to humanity's eternal fascination with the distant and the different, our need to explore, to connect, and to understand the vast world that lies beyond our doorstep. Beyond the famous silks and spices, the Silk Road carried treasures and technologies that would fundamentally transform the societies they reached, often in ways that took centuries to fully unfold. These exchanges represented more than simple commerce. They were transfers of human knowledge and capability that rippled across time. Gunpowder, one of China's most consequential inventions, began its westward journey along the Silk Road sometime around the 9th or 10th century. The Chinese had discovered the explosive properties of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal while seeking elixirs of immortality, a fitting irony for a substance that would revolutionize warfare. Initially used for fireworks and signals, gunpowder's military applications gradually spread westward through the Islamic world and eventually reached Europe by the 13th century. This single technology would fundamentally alter the balance of power across 3 continents, rendering medieval castles obsolete and changing the very nature of warfare. Yet it traveled quietly, almost invisibly, passed from alchemist to alchemist, from one experimental workshop to another, along routes worn smooth by centuries of caravans. The art of glassmaking flowed in the opposite direction, from west to east. While the Chinese had produced glass objects for centuries, they had never achieved the clarity and brilliance of Roman and later Islamic glassware. Syrian glassmakers, particularly those from the city of Aleppo, were considered the finest craftsmen in the medieval world. Their techniques for creating clear, colorless glass and for decorating vessels with enamel and gilt traveled eastward, influencing Chinese glassmaking during the Qing dynasty. In Beijing's Forbidden City today, you can still see examples of glass vessels that blend Chinese and Syrian techniques, physical embodiments of the Silk Road's cultural synthesis. Textiles other than silk made equally important journeys along these routes. The secret of silk production eventually leaked beyond China's borders. According to legend, around 550 CE, 2 Nestorian monks smuggled silkworm eggs to the Byzantine Empire, hidden inside hollow bamboo canes. Whether this story is precisely true or not, silk production did spread to Byzantium, Persia, and eventually Europe, though Chinese silk retained its reputation for superior quality for centuries. Meanwhile, cotton cloth from India, wool from Central Asia, and later, velvet techniques from Persia all traveled the routes, each textile carrying with it not just material but the accumulated knowledge of generations of weavers. The Silk Road facilitated the exchange of artistic techniques that transformed visual culture across Eurasia. The Buddhist art of the Gandhara region, in what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, blended Greek sculptural traditions with Indian religious iconography, creating a unique hybrid style. As Buddhism spread along the Silk Road into China, these Greco-Buddhist artistic conventions traveled with it, influencing how Chinese artists depicted religious figures. Similarly, Chinese landscape painting techniques, with their emphasis on empty space and atmospheric perspective, gradually influenced Persian miniature painting, while Islamic geometric patterns and calligraphy found their way into Chinese decorative arts, particularly in regions with significant Muslim populations. Precious stones and minerals were among the most concentrated forms of wealth that traveled the Silk Road. Lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone prized since ancient times, came primarily from mines in Badakhshan, in what is now northeastern Afghanistan. This single source supplied the ancient world. Lapis lazuli has been found in Egyptian tombs, Roman jewelry, and Chinese ritual objects. The stone was ground into powder to create ultramarine pigment, the most expensive and prized blue color available to artists until synthetic ultramarine was invented in the 19th century. When you see the deep blue in a Renaissance painting or an illuminated Persian manuscript, you're looking at stone that traveled the Silk Road, transformed from mountain rock into artistic immortality. Jade, revered in Chinese culture for millennia, came primarily from the oasis city of Khotan, located along the southern Silk Road route. The Chinese prized jade above gold, believing it possessed spiritual properties and represented virtue and immortality. The quest for jade was one of the driving forces behind China's expansion into Central Asia, and control of the jade routes was often as important as control of the silk trade itself. Khotan's jade cutters were legendary craftsmen, and the city grew wealthy from this single resource. Even today, nephrite jade from this region remains among the most valued in the world. The spice trade, while often discussed in the context of maritime routes, also flowed along the Silk Road's overland paths. Black pepper from India's Malabar coast was literally worth its weight in silver in medieval Europe. It was so valuable that it was used to pay rent, dowries, and taxes. Cinnamon, cassia, ginger, and cardamom all commanded extraordinary prices. These spices weren't merely luxuries for flavoring food. They were essential for preserving meat, creating medicines, and producing perfumes and incense. The markup on spices by the time they reached European markets could be as high as several thousand%, reflecting not just greed but the genuine costs and risks of transportation across such vast distances. A single successful spice caravan could make a merchant wealthy for life. Astronomical and mathematical knowledge flowed bidirectionally along the Silk Road with profound consequences. Indian mathematicians developed the decimal number system and the concept of zero, revolutionary ideas that transformed mathematics. These concepts traveled westward through Persia, where they were adopted and refined by Islamic scholars, and eventually reached Europe where they gradually replaced the cumbersome Roman numeral system. Simultaneously, Greek astronomical texts and instruments traveled eastward, influencing Chinese and Islamic astronomy. The astrolabe, a sophisticated instrument for measuring the positions of stars and planets, was refined in the Islamic world and traveled both east to China and west to Europe, becoming an essential tool for navigation and timekeeping across 3 continents. A merchant carefully wraps a piece of lapis lazuli, its deep blue surface catching the lamplight. Beside him, another trader measures out precious peppercorns, counting them as carefully as if they were gems, which, in a sense, they are. In the corner of the caravanserai, a scholar transcribes an astronomical text, translating from Persian into Chinese, each character a small bridge between worlds. These exchanges seem mundane, routine even, but cumulatively they represent something extraordinary. The patient, persistent weaving together of human knowledge and capability across the greatest distances imaginable. The Silk Road's true treasure wasn't any single commodity, but rather this: the radical idea that distance need not mean isolation, that difference need not mean incomprehension, and that the combined knowledge of humanity belongs, ultimately, to all humanity. All things, even the greatest of human achievements, eventually fade. The Silk Road that had connected civilizations for over 1,000 years began its slow decline in the 15th century, not through any single catastrophic event, but through the gradual shifting of technologies, politics, and trade patterns that would reshape the world. The rise of maritime trade routes dealt perhaps the most decisive blow to the overland Silk Road. In the late 15th century, European explorers like Vasco da Gama successfully navigated around Africa to reach India by sea, opening oceanic routes that could transport far larger quantities of goods than any camel caravan. A single Portuguese carrack could carry as much cargo as hundreds of camels, and while sea voyages had their own dangers, they eliminated the need to pay taxes and tolls to the numerous kingdoms and territories that lined the overland routes. By the early 16th century, maritime trade had begun to eclipse the ancient land routes, and the great Silk Road cities found their fortunes dwindling as ships rather than caravans became the primary carriers of east-west commerce. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Empire disrupted traditional trade patterns between Europe and Asia. While the Ottomans didn't close these routes, they profited from them. The political fragmentation and increased tensions between Christian Europe and the expanding Ottoman state made overland trade more complicated and costly. European merchants, already exploring alternative routes, found additional motivation to seek direct sea passages to Asia that would bypass Ottoman territories entirely. This geopolitical shift accelerated the search for new routes that would ultimately lead to the Age of Exploration and the European discovery of the Americas. Central Asia itself underwent profound political changes that affected the Silk Road's viability. The disintegration of the Mongol Empire in the 14th century ended the Pax Mongolica that had made long-distance overland travel relatively safe and efficient. The successor states that emerged were often in conflict with one another, making trade routes less secure. Tamerlane, who built a vast empire in Central Asia in the late 14th century, briefly revived some Silk Road cities, particularly his capital of Samarkand, which he transformed into a magnificent center of art and learning. But his empire fragmented after his death in 1405, and the instability that followed made merchants increasingly reluctant to risk the overland routes. Climate change played a subtle but significant role in the Silk Road's decline. The period from roughly 1300 to 1850 is known to climatologists as the Little Ice Age, when global temperatures dropped and weather patterns shifted. These changes had particularly harsh effects on the marginal environments of Central Asia. Regions that were already challenging became even more inhospitable. Oasis cities that had relied on carefully managed water systems found their sources less reliable. Pasture lands for the animals that sustained trade became scarcer. While these environmental changes weren't dramatic enough to cause immediate collapse, they made an already difficult journey even more arduous, tipping the balance further in favor of maritime alternatives. The treasure fleets of the Chinese Ming dynasty, commanded by the Admiral Zhang He in the early 15th century, represented China's own turn toward maritime trade. Between 1405 and 1433, Zhang He led 7 massive naval expeditions that traveled as far as East Africa, commanding fleets of enormous treasure ships that dwarfed anything Europeans would build for another century. These expeditions demonstrated that China could access the trade goods it desired through sea routes, reducing the importance of the overland Silk Road to Chinese interests. When the Ming dynasty later adopted more isolationist policies and ceased these naval expeditions, they also reduced their engagement with Central Asian trade, further diminishing traffic along the ancient routes. Even as the Silk Road declined as a commercial highway, its legacy endured in countless ways. The cities it had nurtured, Samarkand, Bokhara, Isfahan, Damascus, remained important regional centers, their magnificent architecture standing as testament to centuries of prosperity. The Registan Square in Samarkand, with its 3 grand madrasas adorned with intricate tile work, was built in the 15th and 17th centuries, during and after the Silk Road's commercial decline, financed by wealth accumulated over centuries of trade. These monuments remind us that the effects of prosperity can outlast the prosperity itself, leaving physical legacies that endure for centuries. The cultural exchanges facilitated by the Silk Road had permanently altered the civilizations it connected. Foods that had once been exotic imports became staples. Pasta in Italy, likely influenced by Asian noodles brought back by travelers. Tea in Britain, a beverage unknown to Europe before contact with China. Coffee throughout the Middle East and Europe, originally from Ethiopia but spread through Islamic lands along Silk Road routes. Religious traditions bore the marks of their Silk Road journeys. Buddhism had been fundamentally transformed by its passage through Central Asia before reaching China, absorbing elements from Greek thought and Persian mysticism along the way. Islam, which spread along Silk Road routes into Central Asia and China, developed distinctive regional characteristics in each place, blending with local traditions to create unique cultural syntheses. The languages of Eurasia retained evidence of Silk Road connections in their vocabularies. Words for luxury goods, trade items, and foreign concepts had traveled along with the objects themselves, becoming permanent additions to distant tongues. The English word candy comes from the Arabic kandi, itself derived from Sanskrit. Orange traces back through Spanish and Arabic to Sanskrit. Crimson comes from Arabic, referring to the kermes insect used to make red dye. These linguistic fossils, scattered throughout our modern languages, are echoes of ancient exchanges, reminders that our words, like our cultures, are woven from threads that stretch across continents and centuries. The sun sets on a caravanserai that sees fewer visitors with each passing year. Dust gathers in corners that once bustled with merchants from a dozen lands. The wells that sustained thousands still hold water, but the paths that brought travelers to them have grown faint, covered by the same sands they once crossed. Yet this isn't truly an ending. The Silk Road's physical routes may have faded, but the connections it forged between peoples and cultures have never been severed. In our languages, our cuisines, our arts, our sciences, and our technologies, the Silk Road continues, invisible but undeniable, a permanent part of the human story, a testament to our ancient and unceasing desire to reach beyond ourselves and touch the vast, strange, beautiful world that lies beyond our borders. 4 centuries after its decline, the Silk Road faded from memory in the Western world, its cities buried by sand and time, its stories preserved mainly in fragmentary accounts and half-remembered legends. But in the 19th century, a new age of exploration would rediscover these ancient routes, and with that rediscovery came a renewed understanding of how profoundly the Silk Road had shaped human civilization. The modern rediscovery of the Silk Road began with European explorers and archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Swedish explorer Sven Hedin made multiple expeditions into Central Asia between 1890 and 1935, mapping vast regions that had been closed to Western travelers for centuries. British archaeologist Oral Stein conducted 4 major expeditions between 1900 and 1916, uncovering buried cities along the Taklamakan Desert's edges and discovering the caves of the Thousand Buddhas near Dunhuang, a treasure trove of Buddhist manuscripts, paintings, and artifacts that had been sealed away for nearly 1,000 years. These rediscoveries revealed that the Silk Road had been even more extensive and culturally rich than historical texts had suggested, with entire civilizations having risen and fallen along its routes, leaving their traces beneath the desert sands. The Mogao Caves near Dunhuang, discovered by a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu in 1900, contained one of the most significant archaeological finds in history. In a sealed cave, later designated Cave 17, Wang found approximately 50,000 manuscripts and documents dating from the 4th to the 11th centuries, written in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, and numerous other languages. Among these was the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text dated to 868 CE, which is the world's oldest known dated printed book. This discovery revolutionized our understanding of the Silk Road's role in transmitting not just goods but knowledge, literature, and religious texts across vast distances. The cache included everything from Buddhist scriptures to Confucian classics, from business contracts to personal letters, providing an intimate window into daily life along the Silk Road over many centuries. German archaeologist Albert von Lecoq led expeditions to Central Asia in the early 20th century, uncovering magnificent wall paintings in the cave temples of the Bezeklik Thousand Buddha caves near Turpan. These paintings revealed a startling diversity: Buddhist monks with distinctly European features, evidence of the Nestorian Christian and Manichaean communities that had flourished along the Silk Road, and artistic styles that blended Indian, Persian, and Chinese influences. The paintings showed that the Silk Road cities had been truly cosmopolitan, places where people of different races, religions, and cultures lived and worked alongside one another, challenging simplistic notions of ancient civilizations as isolated and homogeneous. The 20th century brought new threats to Silk Road heritage, even as scholars worked to understand it. Many artifacts discovered by early explorers were removed to museums in Europe, Russia, and elsewhere, a practice now controversial but which, ironically, may have preserved some materials that would otherwise have been lost to the political upheavals and conflicts of the 20th century. The Russian Revolution, 2 World Wars, the Chinese Civil War, and subsequent political turmoil in Central Asia all took their toll on Silk Road sites. Some locations, like the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, monumental 6th century statues carved into a cliff face, survived for over a millennium only to be destroyed in 2001, a devastating loss of irreplaceable cultural heritage that had once marked an important stop along the Silk Road. Modern genetics has provided surprising evidence of Silk Road connections that historical documents alone could never reveal. DNA studies of populations across Eurasia have traced ancient migration patterns and genetic exchanges that parallel the routes of the Silk Road. Researchers have found genetic markers linking Central Asian populations to both East Asian and European groups, physical evidence written in human genomes of the intermixing that occurred over centuries of trade and travel. Even more remarkably, genetic analysis of the plague bacterium Yersinia pestis has allowed scientists to trace the likely route the Black Death followed from Central Asia westward along Silk Road pathways, confirming historical accounts through biological evidence. In the 21st century, China has launched its Belt and Road Initiative, explicitly invoking the legacy of the ancient Silk Road. This massive infrastructure project aims to connect Asia, Europe, and Africa through a network of railways, highways, ports, and pipelines, echoing the ancient routes but using modern technology. While the initiative is controversial and complex in its geopolitical implications, it demonstrates how the Silk Road continues to shape contemporary thinking about international trade and cultural exchange. The ancient routes are being retraced by modern highways and high-speed rail lines, and cities that once prospered from camel caravans now look to container trains and fiber-optic cables as their paths to renewed relevance. Tourism has emerged as a new form of Silk Road traffic, with travelers from around the world now following in the footsteps of ancient merchants and pilgrims. Cities like Samarkand, Bokhara, and Xi'an have become destinations for those seeking to connect with this ancient history. The Karakoram Highway, opened in 1979 and connecting Pakistan with China through some of the same mountain passes crossed by ancient caravans, is now one of the highest paved international roads in the world, allowing modern travelers to traverse routes that once took months in a matter of days. UNESCO has designated numerous Silk Road sites as World Heritage Sites, recognizing their importance to our shared human heritage and working to preserve them for future generations. The Silk Road's legacy lives on in unexpected ways in our globalized modern world. The very concept of cultural exchange, of mutual benefit through trade and communication across differences, these are Silk Road ideas that continue to resonate. When we log onto the internet and connect instantly with someone halfway around the world, when we taste cuisines that blend culinary traditions from multiple continents, when we appreciate art that synthesizes diverse cultural influences, we are, in a sense, still traveling the Silk Road. The routes may be digital rather than physical, the speed instantaneous rather than measured in months and years, but the fundamental human impulse remains the same: the desire to connect, to exchange, to learn from those who are different from ourselves. And so our journey along the Silk Road comes full circle. From its beginning over 2,000 years ago, when a Chinese diplomat returned from the West with tales of magnificent horses, through its golden age when cities glittered with the wealth of 3 continents, through its slow decline as ships replaced camels and empires rose and fell, to its rediscovery and its continuing influence on our modern world, the Silk Road endures. Not as a physical place you can visit, not as a single route on a map, but as something more enduring. An idea, a testament to what humans can achieve when we choose connection over isolation, exchange over suspicion, and curiosity over fear. The camels are silent now. The caravanserais stand empty beneath the stars. But the spirit of the Silk Road, that patient, persistent belief that the journey matters, that distance can be overcome, that differences can be bridges rather than barriers, that spirit lives on. In every exchange between cultures, in every act of reaching across differences to find common ground, in every moment when we choose to learn from those unlike ourselves, we walk the Silk Road still. Sleep now, traveler. Rest beside these ancient routes. The journey is complete, but the story never truly ends. For as long as humans dream of distant horizons and dare to seek them, as long as we believe that what lies beyond our borders can enrich rather than threaten us, the Silk Road will continue, invisible threads connecting past to present, weaving all of humanity into a single, intricate, beautiful tapestry. Good night.